Imagine waking before sunrise to discover an entire army, silent.
No battle cries, no clashing swords, no desperate retreat.
Just tens of thousands of warriors lying motionless across the battlefield. Nearly 3,000 years ago, the most powerful empire on earth marched toward Jerusalem with absolute confidence. Their king had conquered nation after nation, crushing every city that dared resist him. Nothing seemed capable of stopping his advance. Then, according to one of the Bible's most astonishing accounts, everything changed in a single night. One angel, one mission, 185,000 soldiers. Was this divine intervention an unexplained natural disaster, or a mystery history has never fully solved? Tonight, we journey into the heart of one of history's most debated events, where archaeology, ancient records, and scripture collide. Before we begin, if stories where history meets mystery are your passion, consider joining us by subscribing to Chronicle Nexus. Every week, we uncover remarkable moments that continue to challenge everything we think we know about the ancient world. History remembers empires by the cities they built and the wars they won. Yet sometimes an empire becomes unforgettable because of a single night it could never explain. Long before the rise of Greece or Rome, before Caesar crossed the Rubicon or Alexander dreamed of conquering Asia, another kingdom cast its shadow across the ancient Near East. The Assyrian Empire was feared from Egypt to the mountains of Persia. Its armies were disciplined, relentless, and devastatingly efficient. The Assyrians did not merely conquer their enemies, they made examples of them. Across the walls of their royal palaces, artists carved scenes of cities engulfed in flames, prisoners led away in chains, and kings kneeling before the throne of Assyria. These reliefs were not hidden inside temples. They were displayed proudly for every visitor to see. Their message was unmistakable. Resistance is futile. Submission is survival. By the late 8th century BC, King Sennacherib had inherited this terrifying military machine. Ambitious, intelligent, and utterly convinced of Assyria's destiny, he expanded the empire farther than any of his predecessors. One kingdom after another surrendered. Phoenician ports fell, Syrian cities bowed, Babylon rebelled and was crushed. Even mighty Egypt struggled to contain Assyria's growing influence. Only one small kingdom remained dangerously defiant: Judah. To the Assyrians, Judah appeared insignificant, a narrow strip of rocky hills surrounding Jerusalem. Compared to the vast empire stretching across Mesopotamia, it was little more than a dot on the map. Yet, geography made Judah extraordinarily important. It sat along the trade routes connecting Africa with Asia. Whoever controlled Jerusalem controlled commerce, military movement, and political influence throughout the region. Sennacherib intended to claim it, but Judah's story was unlike that of any other nation. Its people believed they were protected by a covenant with the God of Israel. Their king was Hezekiah. Unlike many rulers of his era, Hezekiah was remembered not primarily as a warrior, but as a reformer. According to the biblical accounts, he removed pagan shrines, restored worship in the temple, and called his people back to their faith. His greatest weapon, however, was not his army. It was his trust in God. That trust would soon face its greatest test. When news spread that the Assyrian army had begun its western campaign, panic swept across the region.
Cities that had stood for centuries collapsed within weeks. Entire populations vanished into exile.
The Assyrians employed psychological warfare long before the term existed.
Before attacking, they often displayed prisoners from previous conquests, reminding defenders exactly what awaited those who resisted. Their reputation alone caused many cities to surrender without a fight.
Hezekiah understood the danger. Jerusalem's walls would not be enough.
The city's greatest vulnerability was its water supply.
If the Assyrians surrounded Jerusalem, every spring outside the walls could be seized. Without water, the city would eventually surrender.
So Hezekiah launched one of the most remarkable engineering projects of the ancient world.
Workers began carving a tunnel through nearly 1,800 feet of solid limestone beneath the city of David. They started from opposite ends, without modern surveying equipment, without electric lights, without maps as we know them today. Somehow, the two teams met almost perfectly in the middle. The tunnel redirected the waters of the Gihon Spring safely inside Jerusalem's defenses, ensuring the city could survive a prolonged siege. Even today, visitors can walk through that narrow passage. Its damp walls still echo with the sounds of chisels that rang nearly 28 centuries ago. Archaeologists later discovered an inscription inside the tunnel describing the dramatic moment when the two excavation teams finally heard each other's voices breaking through the rock. It remains one of the most extraordinary engineering achievements from biblical times. Yet tunnels alone could not stop Assyria. As Sennacherib's armies advanced, fortified cities across Judah fell one after another. The most famous was Lachish. Located southwest of Jerusalem, Lachish was Judah's second most important city. Its walls were formidable. Its defenders were determined. But the Assyrians were masters of siege warfare. Using massive ramps built from thousands of tons of stone, they slowly advanced battering rams toward the city walls. Archers covered every movement. Engineers worked day and night. The defenders fought desperately from above, hurling stones and firing arrows, but Assyria's relentless tactics eventually overwhelmed them. The city fell. What happened afterward shocked even later generations. Excavations at Lachish have uncovered burned buildings, arrowheads scattered across the ruins, smashed fortifications, and mass graves, silent testimony to the brutality recorded in ancient sources. Sennacherib celebrated the victory by decorating his palace in Nineveh with enormous reliefs depicting every stage of the siege. Ironically, those carvings have become some of the strongest archaeological confirmations that this campaign truly occurred. Jerusalem watched in horror. Smoke from destroyed cities drifted across the hills. Refugees flooded through the gates, carrying stories of unimaginable violence. Families who had lost everything crowded the streets. Fear spread faster than the Assyrian army itself. Inside the royal palace, Hezekiah faced an impossible choice. Surrender and become another puppet king. Fight and almost certainly lose. Or trust that somehow, against every military calculation, Jerusalem would survive. It was a decision that would determine not only the fate of a city, but perhaps the future of biblical history itself.
Because outside the walls, the greatest army on earth was already marching closer.
And leading it was a king who had never accepted defeat. What happened next would become one of the most astonishing nights ever recorded in Scripture, and one of the greatest mysteries ancient history has never fully resolved. The dust rising on the horizon was more than a sign of an approaching army. It was the shadow of an empire. As the Assyrian columns advanced toward Jerusalem, the ground seemed to tremble beneath thousands of marching feet. Infantry moved in disciplined formations. Cavalry rode along the flanks. Massive siege equipment rolled behind them, pulled by teams of oxen. Supply caravans stretched for miles, ensuring that the world's most powerful military machine could sustain a lengthy campaign. For the people watching from Jerusalem's walls, the sight must have been overwhelming. This was no ordinary invading force. It was the army that had conquered kingdoms far larger and wealthier than Judah. Every soldier represented years of military training. Every commander had earned his rank through relentless campaigns. They were professionals, hardened by decades of war. When they finally established camp around Jerusalem, there was little doubt about the outcome, at least from a human perspective.
The Assyrians had done this countless times before. They surrounded a city, they cut off supplies, they waited.
Eventually, hunger, thirst, and fear accomplished what battering rams could not. But Sennacherib wanted more than another victory. He wanted complete psychological surrender. Instead of immediately launching an assault, he sent one of his highest-ranking officials, known in the Bible as the Rabshakeh, to deliver a message. Standing within earshot of Jerusalem's walls, the envoy spoke loudly in Hebrew rather than his own language. It was a calculated move. The message was not intended for King Hezekiah alone. It was meant for every frightened family listening from the walls above. The words struck like arrows. Do not let Hezekiah deceive you. The Assyrian spokesman mocked Judah's confidence. He ridiculed their military strength. He laughed at their alliances. Most of all, he mocked their faith. Had not every other nation's gods failed to save them? Had the gods of Hamath survived? What about Arpad? Sepharvaim, Samaria, each had fallen before Assyria. Why should Jerusalem's God be any different? The challenge was devastating because on the surface, it seemed logical. Every nation Assyria had conquered believed its gods would protect it. None had. To the Assyrians, victory in battle proved the superiority of their own gods. Every conquered city was evidence that Assyria's divine favor was unstoppable. The psychological impact inside Jerusalem cannot be overstated. Parents looked at their children. Soldiers tightened their grip on worn spears. Merchants who had once filled the marketplaces now wondered whether they would live to see another sunrise. The silence inside the city was almost as terrifying as the voices outside its walls. According to the biblical account, Hezekiah had already instructed his officials not to answer the Assyrian envoy. No insults. No negotiations, no debate, only silence. It was a remarkable display of discipline, yet silence did not erase fear. When the royal officials returned to Hezekiah, they tore their clothes, a traditional expression of grief and despair. The situation had become desperate. Military options had all but disappeared.
Diplomatic solutions were exhausted. The enemy stood at the gates. In that moment, Hezekiah did something unexpected. He did not summon his generals. He did not inspect the city's defenses. He did not order a final attack. Instead, he went to the temple. The king entered wearing sackcloth, the rough garment associated with mourning and humility. Before God, titles and crowns meant nothing. The Bible describes a king who came not as a ruler demanding victory, but as a man acknowledging his complete dependence. Then Hezekiah sent messengers to one of the most influential figures in Judah, the prophet Isaiah. Isaiah had spent decades warning kings against arrogance, corruption, and misplaced trust. Now his counsel would be tested like never before. The message delivered to Isaiah was simple and painfully honest. This day is a day of distress. The prophet's response came quickly. Hezekiah was told not to fear the words spoken by the Assyrians. According to Isaiah, Sennacherib would not capture Jerusalem. Instead, he would hear a report that would cause him to return to his own land. There, he would meet his end. To anyone watching events unfold, such a prediction must have seemed impossible. Outside the walls stood one of history's greatest armies. Inside the city was a kingdom running out of options. Yet Isaiah's confidence never wavered. Meanwhile, events beyond Jerusalem were beginning to shift. Reports reached Sennacherib that Egyptian and Cushite forces were moving northward. Although historians continue to debate the scale of this threat, the Assyrian king temporarily redirected part of his attention. Before leaving, however, he sent another message to Hezekiah. This second letter was even more direct than the first. Do not trust your God. Look at every nation Assyria has destroyed. None escaped, neither will you. When Hezekiah received the letter, he did something profoundly symbolic. He carried it into the temple. There, according to Scripture, he spread the letter before the Lord. It is one of the most human moments in the biblical narrative. Imagine the scene. No royal court, no cheering crowds, no military advisors. Only a king standing in silence before God, placing the enemy's threats on the floor as though saying, I cannot answer this, but you can. His prayer is striking for its humility. He acknowledges God's sovereignty. He recognizes Jerusalem's weakness. He admits that Assyria has indeed conquered many nations. But then he makes one crucial distinction. Those nations worshipped idols made by human hands. The God of Israel, Hezekiah declares, is the creator of heaven and earth. The prayer is not centered on survival alone. It is centered on God's reputation among the nations. Whether viewed as history, theology, or literature, it is one of the Old Testament's most powerful royal prayers. Soon afterward, Isaiah delivered another message. This one was longer, more poetic, more dramatic. Jerusalem would not fall. The Assyrian king would not even enter the city. No arrow would be fired against it. No siege ramp would reach its walls. The army would leave the same way it had come. From a military standpoint, the prophecy bordered on the impossible. Siege warfare was predictable. Large armies rarely abandoned campaigns against isolated cities without compelling reasons. Everything known about Assyrian strategy suggested Jerusalem's defeat was only a matter of time. Yet, as evening settled over the Judean hills, something unusual filled the air.
The shouting from the Assyrian camp grew quieter. Campfires flickered across the valley like thousands of stars resting upon the earth.
Soldiers prepared meals. Armor was set aside. Horses settled into restless sleep. Guards rotated through the night watches.
Inside Jerusalem, few likely slept. Some families gathered together in whispered prayer. Others listened for the first sound of attack, every creak of wood, every distant shout. Every gust of wind against the walls carried the possibility that the siege had begun. Hours passed. The city remained untouched. Then came the darkness. The Bible describes what happened next with remarkable simplicity. It offers no elaborate battle scene, no clash of armies, no heroic charge from Jerusalem's defenders. Instead, it records a single breathtaking statement. During that night, the angel of the Lord went out. Nothing more is said about the movement. No description, no appearance, no explanation, only the result. By dawn, history itself would seem to stop breathing. If you're fascinated by the hidden stories behind history and the Bible, subscribe to Chronicle Nexus and join us as we uncover the mysteries that shaped our world. Before we witness what awaited the people of Jerusalem at first light, consider this question. If you had stood on those walls that night, hearing only silence where an invading army had camped, what would you have believed was happening beyond the darkness? Was it divine intervention, an unseen natural catastrophe, or something history has yet to fully explain? Share your thoughts in the comments below. Some of the most fascinating discussions happen there, and we'd love to hear your perspective as we continue exploring where history meets mystery. The sun was beginning to rise over the hills of Judah. Within minutes, one of the most astonishing mornings in ancient history would unfold. The first light of dawn crept slowly across the hills surrounding Jerusalem. As the eastern sky shifted from deep blue to pale gold, the watchmen on the city walls strained their eyes toward the vast Assyrian encampment below. At first, nothing seemed unusual. Thousands of tents still covered the valley. Spears stood planted in the earth. Chariots remained exactly where they had been left the evening before. Campfires had burned down to glowing embers. From a distance, it looked as though the greatest army on earth was simply slow to awaken. But something was wrong. There were no trumpet calls, no shouted commands. No soldiers preparing breakfast, no horses being saddled, no movement. The silence that had settled over the camp during the night had not been broken by morning. Minutes passed. Then more. Still nothing. The watchmen exchanged uneasy glances. An army of this size should have been alive with activity before sunrise. Instead, it remained unnervingly still. Eventually, scouts were sent to investigate. Step by cautious step, they descended from Jerusalem's gates and approached the enemy camp. Every expectation told them they were walking into an ambush. Perhaps the Assyrians were hiding. Perhaps they were preparing a surprise assault. Perhaps this silence itself was another weapon. But as the scouts drew closer, an astonishing reality emerged. The soldiers were not hiding. They were not preparing for battle. They were dead. Tent after tent revealed the same unimaginable scene. Warriors lay exactly where they had slept. Officers remained beside their command posts. Guards still stood at their assigned positions, lifeless. Weapons had never been drawn, shields had never been raised, the battle everyone feared had never taken place. According to the biblical account in 2 Kings 19, Isaiah 37, and 2 Chronicles 32, the angel of the Lord had struck down 185,000 Assyrian soldiers during the night. No human army claimed the victory. No military strategy explained it. No eyewitness described a struggle. Only the outcome remained. One of the largest armies in the ancient world had been rendered powerless between sunset and sunrise. For the people of Jerusalem, the sight must have been overwhelming. Only hours earlier, they had expected death or slavery. Now the enemy that had inspired terror across the ancient Near East lay silent before their walls. The impossible had happened, yet the mystery was only beginning. How could an event of such magnitude occur? And why do ancient records outside the Bible remain strangely quiet about the catastrophe itself? To answer those questions, historians begin not with what the Assyrians wrote, but with what they chose not to write. In the ancient world, kings did not compose objective histories. Royal inscriptions were instruments of power. Victories were celebrated in exquisite detail. Failures were minimized or erased altogether. Few examples illustrate this better than the inscriptions of King Sennacherib. Among the most famous is the Taylor Prism, a six-sided clay inscription discovered in the 19th century and now preserved in museums. On it, Sennacherib proudly recounts his campaign against Judah. He lists dozens of conquered cities. He boasts of capturing more than 200,000 people. He describes Hezekiah as being shut up like a bird in a cage inside Jerusalem. It is a vivid and triumphant account. Yet one remarkable detail is missing. He never claims to have captured Jerusalem. For an Assyrian king, that silence is extraordinary. Whenever Assyria achieved a decisive victory, its rulers celebrated it relentlessly. Entire palace walls were devoted to military triumphs. If Jerusalem had fallen, historians would expect the event to dominate Assyrian propaganda. Instead, the city is left unconquered. The campaign simply moves on. To many scholars, this omission is historically significant. Even researchers who do not accept the biblical explanation often acknowledge that Sennacherib failed to take Jerusalem. The question is why? Over the centuries, several theories have emerged. One possibility is disease. Ancient armies lived in crowded camps where sanitation was poor and clean water was often scarce. An outbreak of plague or another infectious illness could spread with devastating speed. Some historians point to epidemics as a plausible explanation for a sudden military collapse. Another theory appears in the writings of the ancient Greek historian Herodotus. Writing centuries later, he tells a curious story involving an Assyrian invasion of Egypt. According to his account, swarms of field mice invaded the enemy camp during the night, chewing through bowstrings, leather equipment, and shields. Unable to fight, the invading army suffered disaster. To modern readers, the story may sound symbolic, yet some scholars have suggested the mice could represent disease-carrying rodents, hinting at a plague remembered through legend. Others believe Herodotus preserved a distorted memory of the same broader campaign that included Judah. Still, none of these theories fully explains every detail. Why did the Assyrians abandon Jerusalem completely? Why did Sennacherib never return to finish the conquest?
And why does the biblical narrative place such emphasis on a single night rather than a prolonged withdrawal? The evidence leaves room for debate. For people of faith, the answer is straightforward. The biblical authors intended to describe a miraculous act of divine intervention. The angel of the Lord became the instrument through which God protected Jerusalem and fulfilled the promises spoken through Isaiah. For historians, however, miracles exist beyond the tools of historical investigation. History can analyze inscriptions. It can excavate battlefields. It can compare written sources. But it cannot prove or disprove the supernatural. That distinction is important. It allows the historical evidence and the biblical testimony to stand side by side without forcing one to eliminate the other. And in this case, they intersect in fascinating ways. Archaeology confirms Sennacherib's campaign. The siege of Lachish is firmly established. Hezekiah's tunnel still carries water beneath Jerusalem. The Taylor prism confirms the Assyrian invasion and even acknowledges that Jerusalem resisted. Yet the Bible alone explains why the city survived. Whether one sees that explanation as history, theology, or both depends largely on the lens through which the story is viewed. But there is one fact that neither archaeology nor ancient inscriptions can erase. Jerusalem remains standing. The greatest empire of its age failed to accomplish what countless victories had made seem inevitable. For the citizens who emerged from the city that morning, the memory would never fade. Parents who had prepared to lose their children embraced them instead. Priests who had feared the destruction of the temple continued their worship. Soldiers who had expected one final battle found themselves laying down weapons they never had to use. Hope had replaced terror almost overnight. Yet the story of King Sennacherib was far from over. The proud monarch who had marched across nations as though no power could resist him would eventually return to Nineveh. There, years later, another astonishing event awaited him, one that Isaiah had foretold long before. And with it, the final chapter of one of history's greatest biblical mysteries. Sennacherib returned to Nineveh not as a defeated king, but neither as a completely victorious one. By every conventional measure, his campaign through Judah had been successful. He had captured fortified cities, devastated the countryside, and extracted a heavy tribute from King Hezekiah. The Assyrian Empire remained the dominant military power of its age, yet one objective had escaped him. Jerusalem still stood. For a king whose royal inscription celebrated absolute triumph, that unfinished victory would remain an unusual footnote in an otherwise remarkable military career. Back in Nineveh, life within the empire continued. Construction projects expanded the magnificent capital. Massive walls surrounded the city. Grand palaces rose from the landscape, decorated with carved reliefs depicting lions, battles, and conquered peoples. Aqueducts carried water across great distances, showcasing Assyria's engineering brilliance. To the outside world, Sennacherib remained one of history's most powerful rulers. But history has a way of reminding even the greatest kings that earthly power is temporary. Years after the events at Jerusalem, the biblical account records that Sennacherib entered the temple of his god, Nisroch, to worship. There, in an act as shocking as it was ironic, 2 of his own sons assassinated him before fleeing the kingdom.
The book of 2 Kings presents the event with striking simplicity, portraying it as the fulfillment of Isaiah's earlier prophecy.
That the Assyrian king would return to his own land and meet his end there. Remarkably, this part of the biblical narrative also finds support beyond Scripture.
Assyrian records and later Babylonian chronicles confirm that Sennacherib was indeed murdered by members of his own family around 681 BC. While the historical sources differ on certain details, they agree on the essential fact.
The mighty conqueror did not die on the battlefield, nor at the hands of a foreign empire, but through violence within his own household.
It is a sobering conclusion. The king who inspired fear across nations could not escape danger within the walls of his own palace. His empire endured for several more decades, but it would never fully recover the aura of invincibility that had once defined it. Less than a century later, Nineveh itself, the seemingly unstoppable capital of Assyria, would fall to a coalition of Babylonian and Median forces. The empire that had terrorized the ancient Near East disappeared with astonishing speed, its great cities eventually buried beneath centuries of dust.
For generations, many even doubted that Nineveh had truly existed. Only in the 19th century did archaeologists uncover its ruins, revealing colossal palaces, royal libraries, monumental sculptures, and thousands of cuneiform tablets.
Among those discoveries were the very inscriptions that illuminated Sennacherib's campaign against Judah, allowing historians to compare Assyrian records with the biblical account in ways that had never before been possible. It is one of archaeology's most fascinating moments. The stones of a forgotten empire began telling the same story as an ancient biblical text, though from a very different perspective. The Assyrians proclaimed their victories. The Bible focused on Jerusalem's deliverance. Together, they form two sides of the same historical episode. This intersection of archaeology and scripture is one reason the story continues to captivate scholars, theologians, and history enthusiasts alike. The physical evidence confirms that the campaign happened. The inscriptions confirm that Jerusalem was surrounded. The engineering works of Hezekiah remain visible today. The destruction of Lachish is undeniable. And yet, one central question remains unanswered. Why did Jerusalem survive? For historians working within natural explanations, possibilities remain open. Perhaps disease swept through the Assyrian camp with astonishing speed. Perhaps logistical challenges forced a withdrawal. Perhaps political developments elsewhere demanded Sennacherib's immediate attention. Ancient warfare was unpredictable, and history often preserves only fragments of what truly occurred. For people of faith, however, the answer has remained unchanged for nearly 3,000 years. Jerusalem survived because God intervened. The angel of the Lord was not a metaphor, nor a legend added centuries later, but the means through which divine protection became visible in history. Ultimately, the evidence allows each viewer to wrestle with the question personally. History can measure walls, excavate tunnels, translate inscriptions, and reconstruct battles. Faith asks whether there are moments when history itself becomes the stage for something beyond human explanation. Perhaps that is why this account has endured for nearly 3 millennia. It is not simply a story about an army. It is not merely a story about a king. It is a story about the limits of power. The Assyrian Empire possessed superior numbers, superior weapons, superior organization, and an unmatched reputation.
By every human calculation, Jerusalem should have fallen. Yet history remembers the city that survived, not because of the size of its army, but because of the mystery surrounding a single extraordinary night. Whether one believes the events were miraculous or searches for another explanation, the outcome remains one of the most astonishing reversals recorded in the ancient world.
One evening, an empire stood at the gates of Jerusalem, expecting another easy victory.
The next morning, everything had changed. It is a reminder that history is filled with moments no generation fully understands. Some mysteries fade as new discoveries emerge. Others become even more intriguing with time. This is one of them. Every excavation beneath the streets of Jerusalem, every newly translated Assyrian inscription, every archaeological discovery from the ruins of Nineveh adds another piece to the puzzle, but never quite completes it. Perhaps that is fitting. Because some of history's greatest stories continue inviting us to ask questions long after the final page has been turned. If you've stayed with us to the very end, you've experienced one of the Bible's most extraordinary historical mysteries, a story where ancient empires, archaeological discoveries, and enduring faith converge in unforgettable ways. What do you believe happened that night outside Jerusalem? Was it a miraculous act of divine intervention? A devastating natural catastrophe later understood through the language of faith? Or a historical event whose full explanation has simply been lost to time? Share your thoughts in the comments below. We read them carefully, and some of the most insightful conversations in our community begin with questions like this. And if you enjoyed this journey into the past, please take a moment to like this video. Subscribe to Chronicle Nexus and share it with someone who loves biblical history, archaeology, and the mysteries of the ancient world. Every week, we explore the moments where historical evidence and timeless questions intersect, stories that continue to shape civilizations thousands of years later. Until our next journey, remember, history tells us what happened. Mystery challenges us to ask why. And somewhere between the two lies the truth, waiting to be discovered. This is Chronicle Nexus, where history meets mystery.